That said, if we just pump MDMA into the water, that's not going to like heal the world, as some people say,
Yeah.
or like slip it into Donald Trump's Diet Coke. It's not going to work unless you're really primed to engage. This is why people aren't going to raves and coming out with all of their trauma, miraculously healed. And there was a case study that I get into in my book that I think really illustrates the power of MDMA to change minds, but also the limitations. This was actually the leader of a white supremacy group who I interviewed, and he'd signed up for the trial not knowing what he would be given, but knowing that he would be taking potentially some kind of drug or a placebo. And he was laying in this experimental setup under the influence of MDMA. And this is in Harriet DeWitt's lab. And suddenly he started having these strange thoughts. And the big thought that emerged in his mind was that love is the answer. Nothing matters without love. And he just kept returning to the word connection. And he started questioning, like, what am I doing with my life? Like, I've been all mixed up with all this like hate and bigotry. Like, this is not the way. It's about love and connection.
Welcome to Living Mirrors with Dr. James Cooke. My guest this week is Rachel Nuwer. Rachel is a journalist who's reported on science, travel, food, and adventure for the New York Times, National Geographic, Scientific American, and many other publications. She's the author of Poached, Inside the Dark World of Wildlife Trafficking, and her new book is I Feel Love, MDMA and the Quest for Connection in a Fractured World. Today, we discuss all things MDMA. Hope you enjoy the conversation. Okay, I'm here with Rachel Nuwer. Rachel, thanks for coming on the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, great to have you here. So you've written this wonderful new book on MDMA called I Feel Love. So I wonder if we could begin with a bit about how you came to write this book.
I am a science journalist, so I'm, curious by nature, and I got into journalism because I want to do as much positive for the world as possible during my finite window of time here. But for the past decade, I've spent most of my effort documenting the illegal wildlife trade. So poaching of rhinos, elephants, tigers, all that kind of stuff, which is pretty depressing. So during the pandemic, I found myself really craving a new intellectual challenge. But again, I wanted to do something in service of the greater good. And I really felt like the time was right for a book about MDMA. There was no modern resource that really brought together the MDMA story, history, politics, culture, science. And with potential legalization of MDMA-assisted therapy on the horizon, I thought that we really needed a book that served this purpose.
Right. Yeah, and you mentioned in the introduction that, Michael Pollan's book on psychedelics was a huge kind of landmark, in this area, but it kind of maybe surprisingly didn't go into MDMA that much, given that MDMA is really leading the charge along with psilocybin in this area. And so, yeah, I think your book was kind of sorely needed to really fill that niche.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, after I had the idea for this book, I picked up How to Change Your Mind, which for some reason I hadn't read yet, and just to see how much he had covered it. And I think it was like 2 sentences he touched on it.
Yeah. And actually, we'll get later in the conversation to Gould Dolan's recent research, which is kind of suggesting that, there's been, as long as MDMA's existed, there's been this debate around, is it a psychedelic, or at least since people have been aware of it. And her research is kind of suggesting that it's reasonable to consider it a psychedelic. But then with Michael Pollan's approach, he was kind of, I guess, going the route of the classical psychedelics, the ones that act directly on the serotonin 2A receptor. And so it was kind of sidelined in his analysis, but we're getting ahead of ourselves. So to go through a bit more kind of systematically, which is a wonderful thing about your book, it really kind of covers the terrain in a really nice systematic way. For anyone who's not familiar with MDMA and the experience itself, maybe you could speak to the actual kind of subjective effects of the chemical.
Yeah, I mean, anyone who's done mind-altering drugs knows it's difficult to put into words how it subjectively feels. And I also must mention the caveat that I have not done MDMA-assisted therapy, so I cannot speak to the subjective experience myself of what that's like, but I have heard that it's completely different. People say, I can't believe this is called ecstasy. This is not an ecstatic experience. This is really hard work. As far as I go, however, I do enjoy some MDMA from time to time in a recreational experience. And the first sign I usually get that it's beginning to take effect is I feel myself smiling, like genuinely smiling for no real reason, except that I'm happy to be here in the moment. All of my anxieties melt away, my sort of neurotic mind tendencies, that little voice in my head that never seems to shut up, goes quiet. I can really fully be in the moment in a way that I can't usually do in my sober life. And usually I'm at a dance club or a party. I get into the music. I feel connected to myself, to others around me on the dance floor. Usually everybody else is rolling. That's the colloquial term for recreational ecstasy use. It's just a really lovely feeling. And I also really appreciate that I have full control. I can have a conversation with someone if I want. I'm not going to do impulsive things or feel like I'm spinning out of control like I would if I had had too much to drink, for example.
Right. Yeah. So I've actually kind of done MDMA a handful of times, but I've done it a few times recreationally and a few times therapeutically, not kind of with a therapist. And I can speak to them being very different experiences. So recreationally in my 20s, it was as you kind of describe in the book, just a sense of real, the feeling that we all, whether or not we realize it, the feeling that we want, a feeling of complete kind of satisfaction, everything's right in the world, love and connection for the people you're with, really a real peak experience, but without the kind of trippy visuals of something like LSD. And then I became interested in psychedelics through the kind of phenomenology, the kind of mystical experience stuff. Didn't think I personally needed any kind of trauma healing or anything like that, like many of us do. And then through exploring other psychedelics, stumbled on the fact there was trauma to be healed, became interested in MDMA, tried MDMA by myself therapeutically, and was actually, it was so, with the intentional turning inwards with music and an eye mask, the coming across traumatic material, it was so kind of charged in a deeply embodied way. It didn't feel like there was still a kind of a something that made it manageable, which is the kind of that loving feeling that MDMA gives, but it wasn't like a light, pleasant experience. It was a deeply intense experience. And unlike things like psilocybin, which people quite often recreationally do by themselves or in a retreat where they don't really need a one-on-one therapist, my experience was that MDMA, I think, is so powerful when it comes to unlocking these things, that the one-on-one therapeutic model, I think, is quite a good container for it. And so I think there's a reason we don't see retreats popping up where it's like, oh, you just come take MDMA in a circle and you'll be fine. Like, I think it can really benefit from the way it's being done in the clinical setting.
Yeah, for sure. So you just did it on your own that time?
I did on my own because,
Wow.
because I'd stumbled into with things like psilocybin, wasn't expecting therapeutic things to happen, but they did, and was like, great, this is wonderful. My mind and my organism seems to have a natural kind of healing intelligence. It knows how to process things, and this is great. And then it feels like MDMA really takes off the brakes of like your ability to, I think it seems to be maybe to do with suppressing the amygdala, but it's whatever the firewall is that stops you from going the memories that are too charged, that's down. And so you can walk right up to something that's very intense. So for me, a few weeks afterwards, it was very dissociated and is too much too soon. Turned out fine in the end. It kind of allowed me to unearth things to work with and process things, but it was definitely the closest thing I would say to like a misstep in my adventures in this,
Wow.
of just going too fast too soon. As I say, it was fine in the end, but I think it deserves lots of caution.
Yeah, for sure. Thank you for sharing that.
Yeah. Yes, that's partly why I'm talking to you today, because it's a really, I'm really grateful for those experiences. Subsequent experience was a lot more well managed by me. But I think it's a deeply powerful chemical that people need to be aware what they're working with and approach it wisely. So maybe with the history, we could go into a bit about kind of how this was first synthesized, because it's kind of interesting that it's so powerful, but unlike these other psychedelics, that it's a synthesized, artificially created chemical, right? It's not something that just pops up in nature.
Right, for sure. It was first synthesized by Merck, the German pharmaceutical company. They filed a patent for it on Christmas Eve, 1912. There was early, back in the ecstasy days in the 1990s, there were rumors that Merck had created it as this World War I soldier like power drug to keep them going, but that's not true at all. MDMA was just a chemical intermediary on some step chemistry reaction that they needed to get to a blood clotting agent. Merck denies that they ever gave MDMA to a human or even discovered its psychoactive properties. There's some questions about that, but unfortunately, they stopped responding to my emails, so I wasn't able to dig into their archives. So fishy. Yeah, MDMA pops up again throughout history here and there. A few Merck scientists looked back on it. There were some Polish researchers that stumbled across it as well. The next significant sort of step on MDMA's story, though, occurred in the 1950s when MDMA caught the attention of the U.S. Army. And this was when the Army and the CIA here were doing experiments on soldiers, on citizens, unethically, oftentimes without their knowledge, in their search for a chemical truth serum. This was MK Ultra and those kind of things. MDMA was under the umbrella of the Army's substances that they were testing. Again, though, we do not know if MDMA was actually given to anyone at this time. I found a doctoral student at the University of Michigan. His name is Nicholas Denome, and he's really obsessed with this question. He's a chemistry student, but this is just a side project of his. And he's made a lot of progress with the Freedom of Information Act, requesting old documents to try to find that sort of smoking gun evidence pointing to the Army giving it to somebody. But he found a citation that seems like it would probably have the answer. And when he asked for the document, the U.S. government said that they could not find it, which again seems extremely fishy. But yeah, I just think it's important to point out that the first person who was given MDMA could have been done so in these unethical experiments. And now, of course, we're looking at using MDMA-assisted therapy to heal trauma that people have incurred from the Army. So it's just an interesting connection there.
Yeah, well done on writing the book when it seems like a lot of this stuff is hidden in behind kind of, shenanigans with bureaucracy of hitting dead ends.
Yep.
And so it seems, you mentioned that we think people, we know people were exposed to it, were given the substance in the 50s and earlier. But am I right that you spoke to the first two named people, the first two people whose names are kind of on record as taking MDMA?
Yeah, I do. Before I get into that story, I do want to mention that since my book came out, I've gotten some random messages from people on Twitter and on email, actually in the UK, one person in Edinburgh, someone else saying that they took MDMA in the early 70s. So right now I'm talking to them and I'm like, well, how do you know it was MDMA? Because that's really interesting. So I did interview the first people we know for sure by name, at least for now, who took MDMA. And this was a couple at the University of California, Berkeley, Karl Resnikoff. He was a chemistry student there, an undergraduate, and his girlfriend, Judith Gips. And we know that Karl and Judith took MDMA because Karl synthesized it as a summer project. And he was specifically synthesizing MDMA because he really liked the other psychedelic drug, MDA. And he himself was a psychonaut, so he had done, lots of experimenting, and he knew that methamphetamine is more euphoric an experience than plain amphetamine. So he thought, okay, I'm going to stick an N-methyl group onto MDA and see what happens, see if there's a similar effect, creating MDMA. And indeed, he and Judith had a great time. They took it on a ferry crossing from San Francisco to Sausalito. And he was really impressed by the fact that there was no sort of scary moments or moments of anxiety like you would on a classic psychedelic. They were both really struck by how open they felt and just how beautiful the world was.
Right. Yeah.
Oh, and I'm sorry, I will say that was September 1975.
Right. Thank you. And I mean, it's a bit of a gamble taking out a ferry when you're messing around with a novel psychedelic that you don't know what it's going to be.
Yeah, I think he considered himself to be a real veteran. But
right.
Good on you. I would not choose to do that.
Yeah. And so he was working with Sasha Shulgin, right? Who's another big figure in the history of MDMA.
Exactly. Yeah. So Alexander Sasha Shulgin was his mentor. Karl was a real fanboy of Shulgin's. And Shulgin, of course, is the psychedelic chemist in the Bay Area who synthesized more than 200 psychoactive components himself and would try them. And then if they seemed interesting, he would call his friends over and they'd all, try out this new drug and sit in a circle and take notes about it.
Right. And so the chemistry of MDMA with Shulgin, he has these two books. One's about tryptamines, one's about phenethylamines, TCAL and PCAL. And so MDMA is a phenethylamine, it's related to mescaline. And so that's I guess, how Shulgin came across MDMA and resynthesized it as kind of just another variation on this chemical structure.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I spoke to people, and unfortunately, Shulgin passed away before I began my book project. I would have loved to have met him. But, I talked to people like Saul Snyder at Johns Hopkins, who was a friend of Shulgin's and, a real titan in the field. And he said, Shulgin wasn't doing complex chemistry. The thing is, he just did it with this passion and dedication because he really loved drugs. So it made sense that Shulgin synthesized MDMA. And we do have evidence from his laboratory notebook that he first created it. I think it was 1968, but he didn't take it for whatever reason. So it came up again when Carl synthesized it with Shulgin in 75. And then we know that Shulgin himself tried it in 76.
Right. And so you have these decades where it exists, but no one's really paying attention to MDMA, right, until the mid-70s. And as you say, these basically seasoned psychonauts who are interested in different experiences resynthesize it, discover that it's got powerful effects. And then it ends up being kind of the idea of therapists using it, right, for in therapy becomes a kind of a thing through these people and through related people.
Yeah, exactly. So it was actually Shulgin who sort of kicked that process off. He introduced MDMA to a therapist friend of his named Leo Zeff. And Leo was literally retiring. He was packing up his office, and Shulgin showed up with a sample of MDMA and said, "Hey, you should try this." And Leo was like, "No, no, no, I'm done. I'm retiring. I'm going to enjoy my quiet life now." But then a few days later, Shulgin's phone rang, and it was Leo, and he said, "Okay, coming out of retirement, I have work to do." And Leo wound up spreading MDMA throughout the therapeutic community, at first in the Bay Area, but then all over the country and even Europe. Really sort of a Johnny Appleseed of MDMA character. So it became a really, really popular tool in therapy, all kinds of things from couples therapy to trauma to just getting to know yourself on a deeper level. And the thing about this period, so this is the mid 70s to right until MDMA's scheduling in 1985, therapists were trying to keep really quiet about this because they knew that if word about this new drug went out and attracted the attention of the DEA here in the US, it would be scheduled, it would be banned, and they wouldn't be able to use it because they had seen what happened to LSD just a few years earlier and related MDA. They were both banned.
Right. Yeah. So because this was it hadn't been, because it wasn't prominent in the late 60s and early 70s, it wasn't banned right along with other psychedelics. And so it was legal when it came out. And
exactly.
It's funny, like from my being born in the late 80s, my kind of perception of MDMA before these recent trials for PTSD happened, I knew it as a club drug in the 80s, and like that was as ecstasy. And then it's like, okay, well, actually, it's this chemical MDMA, and they're trying it now for clinical purposes. But then you discover that actually it came out of this kind of personal growth, therapeutic, spiritual actualization, West Coast kind of post hippie area. And so it was initially about the therapeutic use, and then it became more recreational use as it kind of, you have this kind of those communities, and then you have the recreational communities, which you can make a strong split there. But also, I think a lot of people would argue that there's something therapeutic about dancing for hours with friends, feeling connected, and so it may not be as strong a split as we think. But the recreational use in the US, is it right that Texas became like a real center for this?
Yeah, for sure. So you summarized it nicely, but there was this tension that arose between people who wanted to use it recreationally and then those who wanted to use it in this really therapeutic, conscientious way. And, they kind of criticized each other, but there was a few people who began emerging as dealers, MDMA dealers in the early 80s, but one really came out at the forefront, and that was a man named Michael Clegg. And he was the leader of what's called the Texas Group. And they have that name because a lot of their members were in the Dallas area. And yeah, Dallas became a real center of ecstasy use in the early 80s, which is just like was very surprising for me to learn. There was a club there called the Start Club, and on opening night, someone flew down from New York with a bag of ecstasy pills and said, just give these out, see what happens. And really just made things pop off at the Start Club. And it became this wonderful place where anyone could go. You could be yourself, all races, genders, whatever, anything went. I really feel like if I could time travel, I would go back to the Start Club in Dallas and just experience this wonderful feeling on the dance floor of everyone hugging it out and, dancing to house music. But yeah, because of things really taking off in Dallas and also in places like New York and San Francisco on the recreational side, MDMA did indeed catch the attention of the DEA, and they called it that kiddie drug, like for kids, because they didn't think it was as serious as things like meth or heroin. And in 1985, they went to schedule MDMA on Schedule 1, which is the strictly banned substances defined as having no current medical value and a high potential for abuse.
Right. Yeah, and it's surprising they went with that kind of narrative, given that it was initially being kind of experimented with in therapy. From the very beginning, people saw a medical value, and I guess it just wasn't kind of on the records enough in the published literature for the FDA to not be able to make that case. And actually, was it Clegg who initially wanted to call it therapy rather than ecstasy?
Oh yeah. There's a whole. This is a fun little rabbit hole I went down during my research. So Clegg allegedly had wanted to call it therapy and had even like printed labels for bottles that said therapy, and he had linked up with this guy also on the West Coast named Bob McMillan. And McMillan had been a major weed dealer, like, huge shipments from Thailand, giant network of people to move drugs around the country and indeed the world. So McMillan was like, okay, I love this drug. I think it's great. MDMA actually broke him of his cocaine addiction. And he said, I will help you push this drug. I believe in this drug, but we have got to change the name. Therapy will never sell. And McMillan had first taken MDMA when he was listening to a new album. I think it was Deuter or something. I haven't heard the album myself, but the album is called Ecstasy. And he thought, okay, that's the perfect name. But the funny thing is that Clegg now, after the fact, says that he's the one who coined the name Ecstasy. So he said this in interviews with Playboy. When I brought it up to him on email, he was like, oh, Bob McMillan's the biggest liar I ever knew. Then when I brought it up to Bob to say, okay, Michael Clegg says he's the one who says it was ecstasy, Bob just started cracking up. So, someone called it ecstasy, but I'm going to go with Bob McMillan.
Yeah. There's definitely in the book. It seems a lot of people testify to Clegg's potentially being an unreliable narrator. To put it
that's a really nice way of putting it. Yeah, exactly.
And so, I mean, is this taking place initially during the period when it's legal, or or
exactly?
Right. Yeah, it's hard to imagine a time where this was just legally available, but I guess also black markets can still flourish during that time.
Exactly. Yeah, it was legal. And the thing about Bob McMillan is because of his experience with marijuana, he was very wary of putting this out there like in a very public way. He said, we have, because his phrase was, we've got to tiptoe through the tulips, Michael. And he wanted to keep quiet about it. He was importing ecstasy to, I think, the UK in like herbal essence bottles, and to Texas in big bags labeled as rabbit food, because he knew that any new drug would indeed be banned. But Michael Clegg was a lot more overt about his use, like very, brash and loud and putting it out there. And a lot of people say, or they don't say, they kind of blame Michael Clegg for the DEA scheduling it, for attracting that attention. But, I think it was inevitable, Michael Clegg or not.
Right. And so, it being legal, I guess, isn't the same as it being widely available through legitimate or like sources, right? So like if because even though Merck had synthesized it, they weren't selling it at pharmacies, right? For certain
exactly.
things. So if a new designer drug came along today, underground and wasn't being produced by a pharmaceutical company, you'd expect it to still be on the black market. And you'd expect them to still lie low just in case, as you say, it attracts attention and it gets banned like LSD was.
Yep, exactly.
Yeah. And then when that banning happened, maybe we can just go into what was going on when the DEA took notice and what led to them banning it.
Yeah, so the DEA found out that everybody at these clubs in Dallas and elsewhere were using ecstasy, so they moved to schedule the so-called kiddie drug. But what they didn't expect was that all of these therapists and scientists were going to rally behind MDMA and try to stop them from doing that. So people like Sasha Shulgin, and even Harvard professors and therapists all over the country came together to put to take the DEA to court and argue that MDMA should be Schedule 3 rather than Schedule 1, which would allow them to continue using it medically and also to easily conduct research on it. And they actually won that case. The judge sided with them and said it should be Schedule 3. You have proven that MDMA does have current medical use. But because this was an administrative law judge and law court, the DEA only had to take that as a suggestion. It wasn't binding. So they just threw out that judgment and did what they wanted to do all along, which was put MDMA on Schedule 1.
Right. Am I right? That created a window where it had been made illegal, but then it was suddenly legal again for a period of time?
Oh, yeah. So, yeah, a Harvard professor named Lester Grinspoon appealed. And for a 3-month window in, I think it was like December to March, like 86, I think. Have to fact check that. But MDMA suddenly became legal again. And a number of people got out of prison because of it or had their charges dropped. And they were writing these like lovely notes to Lester Grinspoon saying thank you. And that's come to be known as the Grinspoon window. But, just as quickly as that window opened, the window slammed shut again and MDMA became illegal. And that's where it's been ever since.
Right. And, you have a whole chapter in the book on prohibition. And, I'm inclined to agree that when you push these things underground, whenever we see deaths and serious issues with MDMA use, it tends to be because it's kind of adulterated with something, right? And not being well regulated. So do you see prohibition as a kind of something that can't really be justified?
Yeah, definitely. It seems really obvious to me now that I've done this book, but I hadn't really ever thought about the effects of prohibition and how that makes things more dangerous and exacerbates harm. I mean, not even from a social justice point of view, but just pure health and safety. So, for example, I interviewed a mother in the UK who lost her daughter to MDMA, but the way this happened is her daughter took way too much MDMA. It was almost pure, and she took a dose that was something like 3 times higher than what you're supposed to. But that is because she was buying MDMA on the black market. She didn't know how much it was, how much molecule it contained or how much it weighed, and she just didn't know what a safe dose was. So that kind of death to me is purely preventable if we just go to a pharmacy and buy a pill and know, okay, this is how many you should take. Another big problem that stems from prohibition is you're buying drugs illegally, you don't know what's in them. So, maybe it is pure MDMA, but maybe it's something more harmful like meth or bath salts or any number of other more toxic chemicals. So people have died that way or been hurt that way. I just think that regulated drug use or drug trade, I should say, would really solve so many of these preventable issues.
Right. Yeah. I mean, if you think about, whenever I take a paracetamol, I check on the packet, is this double strength? I want to make sure I get the dose right because I know it can be deadly if you get it wrong. And so if you're getting paracetamol on the black market and you weren't sure of the concentration, we'd be seeing paracetamol deaths all the time.
For sure.
That's easily avoidable by having it be regulated.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I mean, anything can be deadly in a large enough quantity, like
right.
water can be deadly. But
right.
you need to have that knowledge. And with the way things are on the black market, people are having to seek knowledge from the internet,
right.
from their friends, from their own experimentation. It's not a good system.
Yeah. Although an interesting side note for the classic psychedelics like psilocybin and LSD, even though coffee and things can be deadly in high enough quantity, psilocybin and LSD, we actually haven't found that
right,
quantity.
Yeah.
So it seems that maybe they can't be.
Exactly. Yeah. Those are the special exceptions for sure.
Right. But actually, so we didn't mention MDMA there because there is kind of interesting literature around that it may be physiologically harmful in a way that something like psilocybin isn't, right? So psilocybin less toxic than a cup of coffee, but MDMA there's complexity around whether it has kind of neurotoxic effects, right?
Yeah, definitely. If you take too much MDMA, you are going to cause damage to your nerves, specifically serotonin nerves. This has been shown in animal studies, and ravers who take too much MDMA recreationally, and that's subjective. It could be people who take it twice a week, people who take it once a week, even people who take it monthly have reported issues with memory, with increasing depression, anxiety. But the interesting thing is, when I've interviewed doctors who have treated patients who say, there was this period of time I was doing too much MDMA, most seem to report that they do, those symptoms are alleviated if you stop taking MDMA and give your brain a break. So
Right.
it doesn't seem to be permanent, but, jury's kind of still out on that.
Yeah, I think it's useful. You touched there on the kind of physiological effects on the actual nerve, on the nerves, but then also the kind of functional consequences, because this is the science has been so co-opted by the kind of propaganda machine against drugs. It's all been kind of distorted, and it can be scary to think something has damaging effects at a physiological level, but it's also relevant that at a functional level it may have no noticeable effect. So if someone's got PTSD and they're feeling suicidal as a result, doing 3 sessions with MDMA spaced out over months, the risk of that versus the risk of not attempting to resolve your issues is a cost benefit analysis, right? So to me, there's the toxicity has it's barely an issue at all there, and whereas it's worth knowing if you're planning to take it every week for a year, that's probably unwise in a way that physiologically wouldn't be unwise for psilocybin. Different case psychologically, but just talking physiologically here.
Definitely. And I will add that it's really an issue of quantity. So in the clinical trials of MDMA assisted therapy, you're doing such a small amount, spaced apart so few times, you're not going to see like memory issues with that. They have not picked up on things like that. We're really talking about recreational users who, do it quite frequently.
Right. And there was a really interesting, you were kind of exploring, it's quite hard to do this research because there are kind of confounds of like most people have, who take MDMA have what you call a polydrug lifestyle, where maybe they're taking other drugs as well, and they're partying, and maybe they're sleep deprived, and so they may account for some of the memory issues. But there was an interesting study with Mormons who take MDMA, right, that kind of avoided those confounds.
Yeah, exactly. It's funny. I just had a party this weekend, and my ex-Mormon friend came over, and I actually consulted him for that part of the book because I was like, "Can you fact check this? Just a sensitivity read to make sure I'm talking about Mormons correctly." But yeah, there was this fascinating study. I think it was around 2005 or so, and as you mentioned, there was this confounding problem of polydrug use. So you're taking MDMA, but you're also staying up all night. You're hammering your brain with ketamine or alcohol or cocaine as well. So it's hard to disentangle whatever effects are from the sleep deprivation, the other drugs mixing with MDMA. So this had been a problem throughout the 90s in terms of trying to establish that, possible neurotoxicity of MDMA. And a researcher got an email from someone in Salt Lake City saying, "Hey, I think I know a way." This is a doctoral student in physics, actually. "I know a way to get around these confounding variables. There's a whole community here of Mormons who take MDMA, go to raves, but do nothing else." So they were able to study the Mormons, and they confirmed through hair and urine samples that they weren't doing any other drugs, including alcohol. And they also had a control group of other Mormons who were true straight edgers, so not taking MDMA or anything else, but were still going to the raves and staying out all night. So they had the same sleep deprivation. And they were able to compare the straight edgers with light MDMA users, which I think they defined as like, 1 to 30 sessions on the drug or something, with heavy users who had done it quite a few times. And they found some minor differences between the groups. But as you mentioned, these weren't really things that you would notice necessarily in your daily life. Things like less dexterity with your non-dominant hand in the heavy MDMA users, or like slightly less quick verbal memory recall of vocabulary words. So not really pronounced things that you would notice in your life.
Right. Were they also not statistically significant? I think you mentioned that in the book.
I think there was the hand use one and the vocabulary recall were slightly statistically significant, but it was like so minor that it could have been something that was just by chance.
Right. Yeah. And that's something, that's worth people keeping in mind with studies, right? If you have when you have a finding, it being statistically significant kind of means that you might have a threshold that's like a 1 in 20 chance, like a 95% kind of threshold of like, if you ran this experiment 20 times, one of those times it would come out correct by chance, but we're willing to call that a kind of a reasonable threshold. But then you get this effect where, so one of the biggest studies coming out kind of against MDMA was published in Science, which is kind of the pinnacle of scientific publishing. But so my background's in science, and to people who work in this area, there's this kind of thing that's often debated, which is that everyone wants to be published in these big high impact journals, but the kinds of things they publish are the surprising results. So if you do that experiment 20 times, 19 times, you don't find an interesting result, that doesn't get published. The one time you get, just by chance, you accidentally get a positive result, that sometimes can end up in Science or one of the biggest journals, because it seems like, oh, this is exciting. We weren't expecting this. This is part of the kind of replication crisis. You just get this whole issue where that statistical artifact, that process is not being accounted for. But then this particular study, it wasn't even the case that just by chance they got a bad result. I'm pointing to the study where it turned out that they'd used meth instead of MDMA, which is a kind of astounding error.
Astounding
if
indeed.
If it was by accident. I don't want to cast aspersions, but it's hard to imagine how you can publish such a as high profile as it gets when it comes to in the scientific literature, but also the press taking it up, and just to say, oh, actually, the thing it's kind of like saying we measured the necks of elephants and it turns out they're meters long. Oh, actually, sorry, we were measuring giraffes. Like, we just got the animal wrong. Whoops. Like, easy mistake to make.
Our bad. The meth study was really unbelievable. And, they had found all these crazy effects on dopamine, and, the implications being that all these ravers were going to drop dead or come down with Parkinson's, which obviously wasn't happening in the real world, which should have been a red flag that, hello, maybe we should take a little bit of a closer look and see what's going on with this very surprising study result. But instead they just bulldozed forward with publishing it. And, we were in this early 2000s, like such a anti-ecstasy frenzy that it passed peer review and got published. And then, as you said, lo and behold, it was meth.
Right. Actually, wasn't there a thing where there was some peer review pushback, but there was, I think the funding came from something connected to prohibition. I can't remember the details.
Was the story. Yeah, that is the whispers.
Right. And so now, thankfully, we're in a more positive era of the media's kind of approach to MDMA, and maybe the most significant figure in that change has been Rick Doblin, right? And you have a couple of chapters where he pops up, but yeah, he's definitely a very interesting figure. Maybe you could just tell a bit about his kind of background and his journey here.
For sure, yeah. So Rick Doblin, he was this kid who grew up outside Chicago, raised with dinner table stories of the Holocaust. So he grew up always with this suspicion that everyone around him could just break out into a genocidal mania at any time. And he really wanted to figure out a way to prevent that from happening, which is an interesting problem for a kid to be chewing over. But he was always looking for a way to bring people together and to dispel this genocidal mania that he felt was always lurking in the background. And in MDMA, he really found the answer he was looking for. This was after like a ton of self-experimentation with LSD and other drugs, and trying all kinds of different therapies himself. So he was part of the case that was pushing back against the DEA on the scheduling of MDMA. He was a leader in that case. And after the DEA did schedule MDMA on Schedule 1, everyone pretty much gave up. They thought, okay, MDMA is gone. It's not coming back. We did our best, but it was a failure. And Rick Doblin was really the exception to that rule. Rick kept going. He was never going to let this go. And I kind of feel like the quest to bring MDMA back into the light of scientific and social respectability sort of became like one and the same with Rick's belief in himself. Like, he believed that he could do this, and this was the right thing to do. And he's just been chugging away at it ever since. And that was nearly 38 years ago. So it's really incredible what he's done. And to do that, he founded a nonprofit group called MAPS, the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies. Yeah, it's a bit of a mouthful. MAPS. And MAPS
Absolutely.
now MAPS now has at least a couple hundred employees. So it's really grown. But at the helm of those efforts has been Rick, and now, all of his colleagues. So I just think it's really commendable and incredible what he's accomplished. And it just shows what one person can do if they really set their mind to something.
Yeah, and was it Rick who first kind of wasn't interested in MDMA because he saw people taking it and they just, he was used to
Yes.
it, LSD and things. It's like, well,
Yeah.
they're functioning, they're having a conversation. Like this can't be anything that
Exactly.
profound.
He's like, how important could it be if you can still talk on the drug? But Rick likes to say he was stupid enough to dismiss MDMA, but smart enough to try it. So he did wind up bringing a sample home and did it with his girlfriend at the time, and was kind of blown away by the ease at which they could communicate about potentially difficult subjects, and just be open with each other. And he and his girlfriend said, like, at one point they questioned, okay, is this just the drug talking? But they decided, no, this is us. It's just opening us up so that we're able to express what we really feel in this really honest, way, without any fear or stress.
Yeah, I think for couples, it can be a really powerful thing for people to work through issues because the thing I spoke to earlier, where it downregulates the amygdala and kind of fear processing. There's so much kind of intimacy that can be had between people, but the thing that blocks it is fear and anxiety, self-consciousness, worry about what's going to
Exactly.
happen if they're going to reject you, all that kind of cocktail of stuff that just makes you feel better just to avoid it and not talk about it. But if you chemically can kind of suppress that, then you can give yourself an opportunity to really meet in a space of love and connection and intimacy. And again, I think it has that effect for couples.
Yeah, it's a really good way of putting it. And people also told me who have done this as couples, when forgiveness is given, when you're on MDMA, it's like, that's it. It's given. It's not like when you come out of the experience, you're suddenly like,
Right.
oh wait, I take it back. I'm still mad at you. Like it's
Yeah.
permanent.
Yeah. Because I think the connection that people want, that's maybe the tragedy of when people fail to connect because of fear, is like, if you can just have that moment of true connection, that's what everyone wants. And so once you've had that and you've seen it, you're not going to, like, you've got the thing you want. You're not going to backtrack and go, you know what, actually, I'm going to prioritize the anxiety and the fear. I'm going to ignore that connection.
Exactly.
The fear is always secondary.
It's a really good point. Yes.
Yeah. So then it's not mainly being studied for this kind of relational stuff, although I'm sure it will be eventually. But PTSD, right, is the big thing that's being kind of studied for now, and that MAPS has been pushing it for. And so maybe you could speak to the kind of current status of that research literature.
Yeah, I will say there is a couples therapy study going on in Canada,
Right.
but it's specifically for partners of people with PTSD. So, slowly the couples therapy thing is beginning to emerge in the literature. But yes, PTSD, MDMA assisted therapy for PTSD is by far the furthest along in terms of clinical trials. So MAPS has sponsored those trials. This has been like a 20 plus year effort on their part, just because of the pace of bureaucracy and all the obstacles they've encountered on the way, from funding to permissions. So the first of two necessary phase 3 clinical trials, which are needed for the US FDA to grant approval of MDMA assisted therapy as a new drug. That first trial has been completed. It came out in May 2021. The results were really, really positive. It was a sample size of around 100 people, and 2/3 of them, after 3 sessions of MDMA assisted therapy spaced 1 month apart each, emerged from that study no longer meeting the criteria for having PTSD. And these are people who have had PTSD for an average of something like 16 years, really severe cases. Many of them had experienced suicidal ideation. Many had substance use issues. And these were people for which other therapies had failed, pharmaceutical and just talk therapy. So those are really positive results. The second phase 3 trial is now undergoing peer review. I've heard that the results are just as positive as the first. So once that is published in the scientific literature, MAPS can submit an application to the FDA for new drug approval. So they're hoping that by about this time next year, the FDA will approve MDMA assisted therapy for PTSD.
Right. And you kind of mentioned in the book that MAPS have kind of opted to do this process on hard mode because they they're choosing to work with people who have where other therapies have been ineffective, and so they could just say, well, this is an effective treatment for your standard PTSD, which would be an easier hurdle to clear. But instead, they've gone for no. We're going to take the people who seem untreatable by our current standards, and we're going to treat them successfully.
Yeah, exactly. That's a really good point. They specifically sought out the quote unquote hardest cases.
Right. Yeah. So it shows just how powerful this is. And so in America, there's all this PTSD research going on, and in the UK, Ben Sess is a prominent figure who, instead of just kind of replicating the same stuff, has chosen to work on addiction, right, and alcoholism. So do you think that's I mean, there's a lot of overlap, right, with people kind of soothing symptoms of trauma with substances. So maybe it's not surprising that by treating the trauma, potentially, it could be the mechanism by which MDMA could help with addiction.
Yeah, exactly. Ben Sess's trial, he's completed one small trial, and I got to interview one of the participants. Just it sounds equally powerful. The guy I spoke with, he had crippling addiction to alcohol because he had been experiencing panic attacks since he was a late teenager, and alcohol was the only thing that could calm him down when he was gripped in that terror. But those panic attacks were originating from the fact that he had seen his mother murdered when he was a child. So the MDMA really allowed him to go straight to the heart of that trauma and revisit it and see it without eyes clouded by fear and judgment, and even in a way forgive his mother's murderer. So I personally hadn't known about the connection between trauma driving addiction to various substances myself. I mean, now that I've learned about it, it seems obvious, but that was a real awakening for me as well.
Right. Yeah. When I was studying neuroscience as an undergrad, I had a lecture on addiction where, I was fully, the model in my brain of addiction was just the kind of chemical hook model that, you take a chemical like heroin, it gets in your nervous system, it hijacks your dopamine, you want that reward, and it's just pure mechanism.
Exactly.
And we were exposed to these experiments and anecdotal things about people coming back from Vietnam, having been addicted to opium, and then or heroin, I can't remember, but opiates, and then not having access to it and seeming to have no withdrawal symptoms as soon as they have connection with family and the other things going on in their life. But it wasn't really explained. I wasn't really given another model to replace the chemical hook model with, because I think the correct understanding involves understanding emotional health, trauma. It's quite an involved analysis to understand what kind of, but it's also maybe more intuitive, more human, that we soothe ourselves with substances and escapism when we're in pain, when we're in emotional pain, when we have unresolved issues, which makes a lot of sense, but is less of a neat kind of chemical story to be told there.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I think as humans we're attracted to those neat, easy answers, but it's almost never the case.
Yeah. And I mean, a big aspect of that emotional pain for a lot of people is disconnection. I think there's interesting research. There's a psychedelic researcher called Roz Watts who did some great work on connection as a kind of common theme in psychedelic work, connection to yourself, to the world, to nature, to others. And MDMA seems to really work, especially with others, right? It seems to work on this kind of social connection level. And we teased earlier on in the conversation the work of Gould Dolan, who's been doing interesting kind of neuroscience work on MDMA. And kind of social reward learning. So maybe we can go into that.
Yeah, definitely. And feel free to jump in. I always feel self-conscious talking about neuroscience to a neuroscientist. I actually gave a talk on my book in San Francisco, and Gould Dolan came to the talk. I was just like, am I right? Is it okay? It was cute.
Well, it was great. It was great in the book. So you're probably more up on her research than I am.
Right. Yeah, for sure. Okay. So Gould Dolan is a neuroscientist at Johns Hopkins. And she has found perhaps the most compelling mechanistic explanation for why MDMA and indeed a whole host of psychedelics work so well as therapeutic agents. Her findings indicate that when given in a specific set and setting where you're primed to do therapeutic work, primed to engage with your trauma, MDMA and these other psychedelics reopen what is called a critical period, which is these finite windows of malleability when the brain is primed to learn new things, the habits and skills that are going to set us up for a lifetime of success navigating the world. Things like learning a language, learning to operate within your cultural framework, learning to walk, see, speak, pretty much anything you can think of potentially has a critical period. So when MDMA is given in a therapist's office, when you're ready, you're mentally primed to engage with your trauma, it reopens what Gould's found to be a social reward learning critical period. Which is just the intrinsic reward we all get from having relationships with others. And, if you think about PTSD, it's kind of it's a breakdown of your ability to connect with others, with yourselves. So it sort of makes sense. But Gould's findings actually are even more interesting because they imply that you can tune the critical period that you're reopening by changing the set and setting. So she and her colleagues at Johns Hopkins are now looking into pairing MDMA with occupational therapy for stroke patients. So rather than do talk therapy, they will do like different movements to try to reopen a motor learning critical period and regain function that they've lost from a stroke. And her findings apply to MDMA, ibogaine, psilocybin, LSD, and ketamine. So, and she's found that these changes occur at the level of DNA transcription, and she's honed in on 65 different genes that seem to be involved in this critical period reopening. So I think given that really profound baseline mechanistic level her findings speak to, that does answer the question, is MDMA a psychedelic? And I think I'm going to go with yes.
Right. Yeah, it's really interesting the kind of shift she's making, because you can study the brain at different levels, right? You've got the kind of zoomed out brain areas that light up with kind of fMRI scans. And then if you zoom down, you've got kind of individual brain cells and the circuits they form. You zoom down further and you've got the receptors that drugs kind of dock onto that affect those circuits, and then the larger patterns activity. And at that level, you've got molecules, right? The drugs themselves, the molecular level, as you say, this kind of baseline mechanistic kind of processes that are underpinning how the brain works. And most people have really they've been interested in kind of, how it connects to the receptors, what happens inside the neurons, how it might affect plasticity. But then people have been really looking at that circuit level of, well, how do the brain cells reconnect to each other, and then how does that change big level things like the default mode network, all these other kind of brain areas. But she's kind of seems to be saying the real pathway is at the molecular level. Like no matter where these different, ketamine connects with MDMA receptors, and then psilocybin connects with serotonin 2A receptors, and lots of different ones as well. None of them are just specific to one. But then she's saying like that's kind of, you're not seeing the forest from the trees. That's the kind of the noise. And then if you look beyond that, what's going on inside the neuron, there's this common pathway of the molecules that are involved, and that's producing this molecular change that underpins what she calls metaplasticity. So not just the ability of the brain to change itself, but these windows where the brain becomes more plastic overall, a critical period where you have a chance to relearn, and particularly the social reward learning thing, right? Which makes sense with because most trauma can be just because if a tree almost falls on you, or a car with no driver in it almost crashes into you, that may not feel interpersonal, but most traumas have some interpersonal social dimension where you've been harmed by someone else.
Exactly.
And so it makes sense that would be part of the kind of healing mechanism.
Yeah, it's just really powerful stuff, and I'm really interested to see what the future holds in terms of her results being replicated, and also testing out this hypothesis of trying to reopen different critical periods.
Right. Yeah, ultimately, I think it will be all the levels of analysis are necessary, right? And we could decide that the serotonin 2A receptor ones do something different with the large scale patterns of activity in the brain, and maybe that's what we call psychedelic, because you're not going to, it's rarer to get something like ego dissolution with MDMA, and so there's not going to be a neat kind of way to classify these things. It's all but it's interesting to see that there's a reason we call all of these things psychedelics, or we think that they're related, right? And she's seems to be pointing towards that.
Yeah, definitely. And I guess a cool caveat in her study too was that cocaine did not reopen critical periods. So
right.
Yeah, it's not all drugs, it's this specific class.
Yeah, it's important to show that it's not just something that anything, oh, you're always breathing when you're on drugs, so that's what they they do.
Exactly.
Kind of and so maybe to end on this kind of way of healing trauma and making us open for connection and intimacy, I think a lot of people come away from psychedelic experiences feeling like this is the medicine for what is wrong with the world.
Mm.
If we can improve the world in a bottom up way by working on ourselves and working on our relationships and kind of rebuilding the social fabric, there's good work to be done here. And so there was an article, maybe it was Big Think, I think, that was extracted from your book recently, kind of exploring this. So yeah, what are your thoughts on that kind of the kind of social implications?
Yeah, I mean, I really want to believe that if we do all deal with our trauma and feel more connected, the world can become a better place. And just going back to Rick Doblin, the world is made up of individual humans making decisions, and individuals can make a positive difference or a negative difference. That said, if we just pump MDMA into the water, that's not going to like heal the world, as some people say,
Yeah.
or like slip it into Donald Trump's Diet Coke. It's not going to work unless you're really primed to engage. This is why people aren't going to raves and coming out with all of their trauma, miraculously healed. And there was a case study that I get into in my book that I think really illustrates the power of MDMA to change minds, but also the limitations. This was actually the leader of a white supremacy group who I interviewed, and he'd signed up for the trial not knowing what he would be given, but knowing that he would be taking potentially some kind of drug or a placebo. And he was laying in this experimental setup, and a researcher was brushing his arm with a feather or something. And it turned out that the trial was to test the pleasantness of touch under the influence of MDMA. And this is in Harriet DeWitt's lab. And suddenly he started having these strange thoughts. And the big thought that emerged in his mind was that love is the answer. Nothing matters without love. And he just kept returning to the word connection. And he started questioning, like, what am I doing with my life? Like, I've been all mixed up with all this like hate and bigotry. Like, this is not the way. It's about love and connection. I'm focusing on the wrong things. So that sounds like a really incredible result. This white supremacist went in and was reformed by MDMA. However, the big caveat here is that he had been doxxed a few months before, which means his personal identity had been leaked by an anti-fascist group in Chicago. And he had lost his friends, he had lost his job, his family wasn't speaking to him. So he was actually primed in a way to like engage with himself, with his choices. And he even says, if I hadn't been doxxed and I'd done the MDMA, I probably wouldn't have had those thoughts. So it wound up being a really positive thing for him. He came out of the trial and he actually connected with the guy who doxed him, the anti-fascist, and was like, how can I become a better person? Like, so they started like a book club and started having sessions on the phone, and he hired like a diversity and equity coach to help him. So yeah, he's not completely quote unquote cured of his bigotry. Like, he voted for Donald Trump in 2020. He says he still has these knee-jerk reactions sometimes to other people, but he can recognize when he's engaging in those hateful thought patterns. So MDMA can be a powerful tool for shifting hearts and minds, but people need to be at least open to that, or otherwise it's only going to reinforce what you already believe about yourself and the world.
Right. Yeah. So the takeaway is we need psychedelic therapy and anti-fascist activism in hand
There
in
we go.
hand.
Yes.
That's the prescription.
That's the takeaway. Yes.
Yeah. And then actually, just before we finish, Australia just over the last week have legalized medical MDMA and psilocybin. I wonder if I can get I wonder if your take is relatively straightforward, just saying hooray, or if there's any nuance there.
Yeah, I mean, so I think that was, what is today, July 3rd? So yeah, 2 days ago, July 1st, MDMA assisted therapy for, I think it's specifically for trauma only, that doctors in Australia can now prescribe it for. I was really surprised when I saw this news announced, I think in February this year, that Australia was just like, okay, you know what, we're doing this. I haven't reported on it myself yet, but I have seen takes from various professionals saying, oh, this is moving too quickly. We need more data, always more data. But I don't know if it's done in a controlled way, if it's done under the guidance of trained professionals and they have had training in how to do psychedelic assisted therapy. I think it can only be a positive thing, especially based on the findings we've seen. But yeah, I mean, Australia is leading that experimental charge. So we'll see how things play out. Hopefully it will go smoothly.
Yeah, no, I definitely agree. A lack of nuance isn't necessarily a bad thing here. I think it's
Yeah.
I think it's just to be celebrated at this point, and as you say, as long as it's done well and responsibly.
Yeah, for sure. There's just like reporting this book has really opened my eyes to the incredible amount of trauma and pain that exists out there in the world. And I think we need new tools to combat that. And yeah, so go Australia. I hope it works.
Yeah, same. Well, thank you so much. This has been great, and I point everyone to the book I Feel Love. And do you have a website or anywhere where people can go if they want to look into your other writing?
Yeah, for sure. It's just my name, RachelNuwer, .com, RachelNuwer.
Great, and I'll put it in the description as well.
Thank you so much.
Thanks for listening. If you're watching on YouTube, please like and subscribe. And if you want to help the podcast reach a wider audience, you can leave a review on Apple Podcasts. Finally, if you want to offer financial support, you can go to patreon.com/Dr. James Cooke.